This is a civil matter. My name is on the deed. I followed the notice, and you can't turn it into fraud just because she's my mother.
I have been sitting on this bench for over 20 years, and I still believe one thing. There are things the law allows, but human morality does not. Have you ever seen a case that looked perfectly legal on paper, but when you looked into the eyes of the people standing before you, you knew instantly something was rotting from the inside? If you think court is just about criminals, let me tell you about the bleakest Tuesday of my career. Case number 24CIV009 wasn't a murder. It wasn't a bank robbery. It was worse. It was about betrayal. The clock on the wall read 8:58 a.m. Outside, the rain was pouring, the sound of water tapping against the glass creating a dull, cold rhythm. But the chill outside was nothing compared to the cold radiating from the man standing at the plaintiff's table. His name was David Sterling, 42 years old, CEO of a rising real estate firm. He stood there, impeccable in a hand-tailored Italian suit that definitely cost no less than $3,000. On his wrist sat a solid gold Patek Philippe, glinting under the old fluorescent court lights. He didn't look at anyone. He just stared at his phone, fingers swiping fast, occasionally frowning at a message, as if being here was a massive inconvenience to his money-making schedule. On the other side of the courtroom, at the defendant's table, was a heartbreaking contrast. Mrs. Martha Sterling, 78 years old. She sat in an old wheelchair, her thin hands, veined and fragile, clutching a crumpled handkerchief. She wore a fraying gray sweater, and beside her, a portable oxygen tank let out a steady hiss. Hiss. The only sound breaking the suffocating silence of the room. Martha didn't have a lawyer. She couldn't afford one. She was all alone, facing the son she had birthed and raised the man who was standing here today to demand the court throw her out of her home. I looked down at the case file. It was ridiculously thin, but the weight of it crushed my chest. Filing, eviction of unauthorized occupant, reason, asset liquidation. Plaintiff, David Sterling. Defendant, Martha Sterling, his own mother. According to the file, David was the legal owner of 42 Oakwood Drive, a classic estate with a current market value of about $1.5 million, and he wanted to sell it immediately. He claimed the market was at its peak, and letting a 78-year-old woman with terminal lung cancer live alone in a 4-bedroom house was an inefficient waste of resources. I cleared my throat, the sound echoing in the empty room. Case Sterling versus Sterling. Parties, please approach the bench. David stepped forward with the confidence of a man who has never known defeat. The sound of his expensive leather shoes clicking against the wood floor sounded like nails being hammered into a coffin. Martha tried to wheel herself forward, the wheels letting out a sharp squeak. A bailiff rushed over to help her. David didn't move a muscle. He didn't turn to look at his mother once. He just stood there, looking straight at me, and flashed a cold, corporate smile. Your Honor, David began, his voice smooth like oil. This is a simple property ownership matter. I have the deed, the title, everything has been in my name since 2014. The defendant, Martha, was given a 60-day notice to vacate, as required by law. She refuses to leave. I am requesting an immediate eviction order so I can list the property next week. He spoke about his mother as if she were an overdue tenant, a bad debt that needed to be wiped from the balance sheet. No word, mother, just defendant. I looked at him, trying to find a shred of humanity behind those gold-rimmed glasses. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice dropping low, the woman sitting there is your mother, and according to the attached medical records, she is currently under hospice care. Do you really want the sheriff to go over there and drag her and her oxygen tank out to the curb? David didn't flinch. He adjusted his cuff, flashing that expensive watch again. Your Honor, feelings have no place in property law. She can go to a state nursing home. I have fulfilled my legal obligations. That house is my asset. I need the capital to invest in a new resort project. Her delay is costing me thousands of dollars a day. Thousands of dollars a day. That was the price tag he put on his mother's final days. I turned to Martha. She was trembling, tears rolling down her hollow cheeks. She didn't look at her son. She looked down at her shaking hands. Mrs. Sterling, I asked gently, do you have anything you want to say? She looked up, her eyes cloudy with sickness, but holding a pain that no words could describe. Your Honor, she whispered, her voice broken by shallow breaths. I don't know what I did wrong. I signed the house over to him 10 years ago because he said he needed it for collateral to save his company. He promised I could stay there until I closed my eyes for the last time. The room fell silent after Martha's words. He promised. Two simple words that hung in the air like a final prayer. I looked at David. I wanted to see shame. I wanted to see a flicker of regret, a twitch in his jaw, anything that showed he was still a human being. But all I saw was a man checking his watch again. Your Honor, David said, his tone clipped and impatient, cutting through the emotional weight in the room like a cold knife. With all due respect, we are in a court of law, not a family therapy session. Verbal promises regarding real estate are unenforceable under the statute of frauds. My mother knows this. She signed the deed. She knows the house belongs to me. This promises she is talking about is a fabrication of a senile mind to delay the inevitable. A gasp rippled through the small gallery. Martha shrank into her wheelchair, her head bowing low, as if his words were physical blows. I'm not senile, she whispered to her lap. I just trusted you, Davy. You're my son. I am a businessman first, Mother, David snapped, turning his back on her to face me. Your Honor, I have investors waiting. Every day she stays there is a liability. I have offered to move her to the State View nursing home. It's a perfectly adequate facility. She is refusing to go because she is stubborn. I am asking for an immediate writ of possession. I want her out by Friday. I felt a heat rising in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. It wasn't just anger. It was disgust. State View? I asked, keeping my voice dangerously even. Mr. Sterling, State View lost its license last month for health code violations. They found mold in the ventilators. And you want to send a woman with terminal lung cancer there? David shrugged, a gesture of absolute indifference. It's what she can afford. If she wanted better, she shouldn't have signed over her assets. That was a business decision she made. Actions have consequences. A business decision, I repeated slowly. Let's talk about that decision. 10 years ago, she signed this house over to you. Why? David sighed, clearly annoyed that I was dragging this out. My company was going through a liquidity crisis. I needed collateral for a bridge loan. She agreed to help. It was a transaction, simple as that. She gave you her home, I corrected him. She gave you the only thing she owned to save your career. And now that your career is saved, your way of saying thank you is to throw her into a facility with mold in the air vents? David straightened his jacket, his patience wearing thin. I am not here to debate ethics, Your Honor. I am here for a ruling on the law. Does my name appear on the deed? Yes. Is she a tenant at will? Yes. Has notice been served? Yes. The law is black and white. He was right. Technically, legally, he was right. And he knew it. That's what made him so terrifying. He used the law like a weapon. He knew that in a standard eviction court, judges are bound by paperwork, not feelings. He expected me to bang my gavel, sign the order, and move on to the next case. He expected me to be a rubber stamp for his greed. But he forgot one thing. I am not a machine. And in my courtroom, I decide when the hearing is over. You're right, Mr. Sterling, I said, leaning back in my chair. The law is often black and white, but sometimes, if you look closely enough, you find a shade of gray that changes everything. I turned to the clerk. Retrieve the original transfer file from 2014, not just the deed he submitted today. I want the full jacket. Every page. David's confidence faltered for a split second. Your Honor, that is irrelevant. The current deed is clear. If it's clear, then you have nothing to worry about, I said, locking eyes with him. But I find it strange. A mother gives up a $1.5 million asset for $0 just to help a son who now wants to evict her. I want to see exactly what was signed on that day. The clerk hurried off. The room was silent again, but this time, the silence wasn't heavy with despair. It was heavy with tension. David shifted his weight from one foot to the other. He stopped looking at his phone. For the first time since he walked in, he looked nervous. Martha lifted her head, her eyes meeting mine. There was a spark there, faint but real, a spark of hope. It took 15 minutes for the clerk to return from the archives. In a courtroom, 15 minutes can feel like 15 years. The rain outside had picked up, hammering against the roof like angry fists. Inside, the silence was so thick you could choke on it. David spent the entire time tapping his foot, a frantic, rhythmic tap, tap, tap that betrayed the cool exterior he was trying so hard to maintain. Martha just sat there, eyes closed, breathing in time with the hiss of her machine. When the double doors finally swung open, the clerk walked in carrying a dusty, yellowing accordion folder. It smelled like old paper and forgotten secrets. She placed it on my bench with a heavy thud. "Here it is, Judge," she whispered. "Transfer records, October 2014. Notarized by a Mr. Arthur Pendleton." I saw David stiffen. He knew that name. "Pendleton?" He blurted out, breaking protocol. He was the family attorney. He's been dead for 5 years. Whatever is in there is ancient history. History has a way of haunting us. "Mr. Sterling," I said, opening the folder. I began to sift through the documents. Standard quitclaim deed, title insurance waivers, tax forms. On the surface, it looked exactly as David had described. A clean transfer of ownership from mother to son for the sum of $1. Love and affection was cited as the consideration. I looked at David. "You bought a $1.5 million home for $1 because your mother loved you, and now you're evicting her because she's costing you money. That's a fascinating definition of love." David rolled his eyes. "It was a legal transaction." "Please, Judge, can we get to the ruling?" I ignored him and kept reading. My eyes scanned the boilerplate text, the endless paragraphs of legal jargon designed to make people stop reading. And then, on page 4 of the transfer agreement, I stopped. There was a discrepancy. The page numbers jumped. The document went from page 3 to page 5. It was subtle. If you were just glancing, you'd miss it. But in the original bound copy the clerk had retrieved, page 4 wasn't missing. It was stuck to the back of page 3, folded over as if someone had tried to make it disappear without physically ripping it out. I carefully peeled the pages apart. The paper made a ripping sound that echoed in the quiet room. "What is that?" David asked, his voice suddenly an octave higher. "I haven't seen that. If that's not in my copy, it's not valid. It's in the court's official archive, Mr. Sterling," I said, my blood running cold as I read the text on the hidden page. And since this was the document filed with the county clerk, it is the only one that matters. I read the heading aloud. Addendum A, retained interest and life estate provision. The color drained from David's face so fast it looked like his soul had left his body. He gripped the edge of the table. That was a draft. She never. I looked over my glasses at him. "It's signed, Mr. Sterling, by you, and by your mother, and notarized by the late Mr. Pendleton." I turned to Martha. "Mrs. Sterling, do you remember signing an addendum? A special page about your rights?" She blinked, confused. I remember Arthur saying something about making sure I was safe. He said, "Martha, sign this so Davy can never put you out." But Davy told me later that the lawyers changed it. He said it wasn't necessary because we were family. "He lied to you," I said, my voice shaking with suppressed rage. I looked back at the document. This clause states clearly, "The grantor, Martha Sterling, retains an exclusive life estate in the property. The grantee, David Sterling, holds the remainder interest only and holds no right to possession or eviction during the natural life of the grantor." I looked up at David. The arrogant businessman was gone. In his place stood a terrified con artist who had just realized his house of cards was burning down. "Mr. Sterling," I said, holding up the page, "do you know what this means? It means you don't own this house the way you think you do. You own the future rights. But right now, today, you are a guest in her house, and you just tried to evict the landlord." "No!" David shouted, slamming his hand on the table. "That's impossible. My bank. I took a loan against the full value. They vetted the title. They wouldn't have given me the money if there was a life estate." The room went dead silent again. David froze, realizing what he had just admitted. I smiled, but it wasn't a happy smile. "You took a loan against the full value, without disclosing the life estate to the bank?" David's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "That," I said, leaning forward, changes this from a civil dispute into something very, very different. Because if you concealed this document from your lender to get $1.5 million, Mr. Sterling, that is called bank fraud. Bank fraud. The words hung in the air, heavier than the rain pounding on the roof. David Sterling, the man who had walked in looking like he owned the world, was now sweating through his $3,000 suit. He pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket and dabbed his forehead, his hand shaking, just enough for everyone to see. That's a very serious accusation, Your Honor, David stammered, his voice losing that oily smoothness. There was no intent to defraud. It was a clerical error. My team handles the paperwork. I sign where they tell me to sign. A clerical error, I repeated, picking up the financial affidavit David had submitted with his eviction lawsuit. Mr. Sterling, you are a CEO. You run a real estate empire. Are you telling me you took out a $1.2 million mortgage against this property and forgot to tell the bank that your mother had the legal right to live there until she died? David looked around the room as if searching for an exit. The bank. They did their own appraisal. If they missed it, that's on their due diligence team, not me. Oh, don't try to pass the buck to the underwriters, I snapped. I flipped to page 9 of his loan application, which was attached to the case file as proof of his financial burden. Right here, question 14, are there any other claims, liens, or life estates on the property? You checked no, and right below it, you signed your name under penalty of perjury. I looked up at him. Do you know what happens when a bank finds out their collateral is impaired by a life estate they didn't know about? Do you know what the acceleration clause is, Mr. Sterling? David went pale. He knew exactly what it was. Every real estate developer knows. It means, I continued, answering for him, that the loan is in default immediately. It means the bank calls the note. It means you owe them $1.2 million. Not in 30 years. Not in monthly installments. You owe it today. David gripped the railing. I don't have that kind of liquidity right now. My capital is tied up in the resort project. If they call the loan, the project collapses. I'll be ruined. You should have thought about that before you tried to kick a dying woman out of her own home to cover your bad bets, I said cold. Suddenly, a sound came from the defendant's table. It was a sob. Martha had her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. She wasn't crying for herself. She was crying for him. Even after everything, she was crying for the son who betrayed her. Davy, she whispered, her voice trembling. You mortgaged the house? But that was the only thing your father left us. You gambled it? David spun on her, his fear turning into vicious anger. I didn't gamble it. I invested it. And I would have doubled it if you hadn't been such a burden. If you had just gone to the nursing home, I could have sold the place, paid off the loan, and nobody would have known. You ruined everything. The cruelty of his words sucked the air out of the room. He wasn't sorry he did it. He was sorry she hadn't quietly disappeared so he could get away with it. That is enough, I shouted, slamming my gavel down so hard it made the bailiff jump. Mr. Sterling, you just admitted in open court that your plan relied on the concealment of material facts. You admitted that removing your mother was a financial necessity to cover up your debts. I turned to the bailiff. Secure the courtroom doors. Nobody leaves. David looked around, panic setting in. What? Why? This is a civil matter. You can't hold me. It was a civil matter, I said, reaching for my phone on the bench. But when a plaintiff admits to federal bank fraud and perjury in my courtroom, it becomes a criminal matter. And Mr. Sterling, I have a duty to report crimes committed in my presence. I looked at the clerk. Get the district attorney's office on the line. And get the fraud division at Vanguard Trust, that's the bank listed on the mortgage. Correct? Yes, Your Honor, the clerk said, her fingers flying across her keyboard. David's knees actually buckled. He slumped into his chair, the arrogant posture completely gone. You can't do this, he whispered. I'm David Sterling. I'm a pillar of this community. You are a thief in a tailored suit, I said. And you are about to learn that in this room, character currency is the only kind that matters. And yours? You're bankrupt. But the twist wasn't over. As the clerk dialed, Martha raised her hand. Her breathing was labored, the oxygen machine hissing faster now. Judge, she wheezed. Judge, please. Wait. I paused. Mrs. Sterling, don't call the police. She struggled to get the words out. He's my son. I can't watch him go to jail. Please. I looked at this woman, this mother whose love was so deep it defied logic. She was willing to let him destroy her just to save him from the consequences of his own greed. It broke my heart, but it also gave me an idea. Mrs. Sterling, I said softly, I cannot ignore the law. But perhaps there is another way to settle this, a way that ensures you are never threatened again. I turned back to David, who was looking at his mother with a mixture of shock and desperate hope. Mr. Sterling, I said, your mother is trying to save you. Again, I don't know why, but she is. So I am going to give you a choice between prison and total surrender. Total surrender. David blinked, wiping sweat from his eyes. The room was so quiet you could hear the rain tapping against the window panes like a countdown. He looked at me, then at his mother, then back at me. What does that mean? I leaned forward, clasping my hands on the bench. It means we are going to fix the mistake of 2014, right here, right now. Option A, I pick up this phone, I call Special Agent Miller at the FBI, and we hand over your loan application. You will be arrested before lunch, your assets will be frozen, and you will spend the next 5 to 10 years in a federal facility. David swallowed hard. He knew I wasn't bluffing. Or, I continued, option B, you voluntarily cure the fraud and restore the victim. And by restore, I mean you give it all back. I can't give it back, David whispered. The money is spent. It's in the ground, at the resort site. I don't care about your resort, I said sharply. Here are the terms. First, you are going to sign a quitclaim deed immediately. You are transferring 100% of the title back to Martha Sterling. No remainder interest, no life estate. She owns it all. Fee simple, absolute. David's jaw dropped. But the mortgage. If I transfer the title, the bank will accelerate the loan anyway. The due on sale clause. Exactly, I said, a cold smile touching my lips. Which brings me to the second part of your surrender. You are going to pay off that $1.2 million mortgage. Today, I told you, I don't have the cash, David pleaded, his voice rising in panic. If I pull that money out of the company accounts, we'll miss payroll, the suppliers will walk, the whole project will implode, I'll be bankrupt. You were willing to bankrupt your mother's life, I reminded him. You were willing to throw her onto the street to protect your investment. Now, the tables have turned. To save your freedom, you have to sacrifice your investment. It seems perfectly symmetrical to me, I signaled the clerk. She handed me a blank quitclaim form we kept for situations just like this. I slid it across the bench toward him. You have 5 minutes, mister. Sterling, I said, checking the clock. At 10:15 a.m., I make the call to the FBI. Or, at 10:15 a.m., you sign this paper and wire the funds to Vanguard Trust to clear the lien. David looked at the paper like it was a death sentence. He looked at his mother. She was watching him, not with anger, but with a profound sadness. She wasn't asking him to do it. She was just waiting to see who her son really was. Mom, David stammered. Mom, you can't let him do this. If I pay this off, the company dies. Everything I worked for, the condo project, the brand, it's all gone. Martha took a shaky breath. She adjusted the tube of her oxygen machine. You didn't work for this house, Davy? Your father did? And you were ready to sell it for a hotel. But I'm your son, he shouted. And I'm your mother, she shot back, her voice suddenly finding a strength that startled everyone. And a mother's job is to teach her child right from wrong. I failed to do that 10 years ago, when I gave you everything too easily. I won't fail you today. She looked him in the eye. Sign the paper, David, or face the consequences. David looked around the courtroom. He saw the bailiff standing by the door, hand resting near his belt. He saw the court reporter pausing, fingers hovering over the keys. He saw me, hand on the phone receiver. He realized there was no way out, no clever argument, no loophole. With a trembling hand, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a gold Mont Blanc pen, another symbol of the wealth he was about to lose. He bent over the document. The scratching of the nib on the paper sounded loud in the silence. Scratch, scratch, Scratch. He signed it. Then he pulled out his phone. His fingers hovered over the banking app. I could see the hesitation. This was the button that would drain his corporate operating account. This was the button that would kill his empire. 3 minutes, Mr. Sterling, I warned. He closed his eyes, let out a sound that was half groan, half sob, and pressed the screen. It's done, he whispered, dropping the phone on the table. Wire sent. Payoff confirmed. I have nothing left. The operating account is empty. Not nothing, I corrected him. You have your freedom, which is more than you were going to leave your mother with. I took the signed deed and handed it to the clerk. File this immediately. The house belongs to Mrs. Sterling again. But as David slumped in his chair, looking like a deflated balloon, I knew we weren't finished yet. Because while the house was safe, the damage he had done to this woman's heart wasn't something that could be fixed with a signature. And there was one more secret in that yellow folder, something Arthur Pendleton had left behind that David hadn't seen yet. Mr. Sterling, don't get comfortable, I said. We resolved the property. Now we need to talk about the rent. David looked up, confused. Rent? What rent? I just bought the house back for her. No, I said, opening the folder to the very last page. You paid off your fraud. Now we are going to talk about the 10 years of income you diverted from her trust. Because according to Mr. Pendleton's notes, this house wasn't the only thing you stole. Stole? David repeated the word, his voice cracking. He looked like a man who had just survived a firing squad only to realize the gun was being reloaded. I didn't steal anything. I managed the family assets. That's what a CEO does. A CEO manages, I corrected him. A thief diverts. And according to the final section of this file, you have been treating your mother's support trust like your personal piggy bank for a decade. I pulled out a ledger that had been tucked into the back pocket of the yellow folder. It was handwritten, the ink faded, but the numbers were clear. Mr. Pendleton didn't just handle the deed transfer, David. He didn't trust you. He knew you were ambitious, and he knew ambition often eats loyalty for breakfast. So he set up a failsafe. I held up the document. The Sterling Maintenance Trust, created in 2014, funded by your father's life insurance policy. It was designed to pay for Martha's medical bills, home repairs, and daily living expenses. You were named as the trustee. Your fiduciary duty was to use this money solely for her benefit. David wiped his face with his silk handkerchief, which was now soaked with sweat. And I did. I paid the property taxes. I paid for her food. Did you? I asked, opening the ledger. Because I'm looking at the disbursement records attached here. I see a withdrawal of $12,000 in June 2016 for property maintenance. But when I cross-reference that date with your social media, which my clerk has pulled up right now, I see photos of you in Cabo San Lucas, staying at a 5-star resort. David froze. I see another withdrawal in 2018, I continued, flipping the page. $45,000 for emergency structural repairs. But there are no permits on file for the house. However, that same week, you posted a picture of a brand new Porsche Cayman with the caption, "New Toy." The courtroom was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner and the hiss of Martha's oxygen tank. Every eye was glued to David. You told your mother the trust had run dry, I said, my voice low and dangerous. You told her there was no money left for her oxygen refills, so she had to use the older, cheaper machine. You told her she couldn't afford a nurse. But the truth is, the trust wasn't empty. It was earning 6% interest annually. You were just skimming the cream off the top to fund the lifestyle that you shoved in her face. Martha let out a soft wail. It was the sound of a heart finally breaking completely. Davy, she sobbed, you told me Daddy didn't leave enough. You told me we were poor. You weren't poor, Mrs. Sterling, I said gently. You were robbed. David slammed his hand on the table, trying to regain some semblance of control. This is irrelevant. I just paid off the mortgage. I just gave her back the house. That's $1.5 million in equity. Surely that covers whatever petty cash you think I owe. Petty cash? I stared at him. We are talking about 10 years of misappropriated funds, principal plus interest, and since you violated your fiduciary duty, We are also talking about treble damages under civil theft statutes. I grabbed a calculator from my desk. The clicking of the keys was the only sound in the room. Let's do the math, shall we? The initial principal was $250,000. With market growth, it should be worth nearly $400,000 today. Instead, the balance is zero, plus the fraudulent withdrawals, plus the penalties. I wrote a number on a piece of paper and held it up. $750,000, I announced. That is what you owe the trust. And unlike the mortgage, you can't pay this off with company funds because that would be embezzlement. This has to come from you. David looked at the number. He looked at me. I don't have that in personal cash. I put everything into the business. If I have to pay this, I'll have to liquidate my personal assets. My car, my apartment, my watch. He instinctively covered the gold Patek Philippe on his wrist. Then you better start selling, I said, because I am issuing a freeze order on your personal accounts right now until this debt is satisfied. You're ruining me, David screamed, his facade completely shattering. You're stripping me naked. For what? For an old woman who won't even be here in 6 months? The cruelty of that sentence hung in the air like poison smoke. Even his own lawyer, who had been sitting silently in the gallery waiting for a turn that never came, looked down in shame. Martha stopped crying. She wiped her eyes with the crumpled handkerchief. She took a deep breath of oxygen, sat up straighter in her wheelchair, and looked at her son with a clarity that pierced right through him. 6 months, she repeated, her voice steady. That's what the doctors gave me. 6 months. She turned the wheels of her chair so she was facing him fully. For 10 years, I thought I was a burden, she said. I apologize to you for being alive. I ate half portions so I wouldn't cost you too much. I sat in the dark to save electricity because I thought you were struggling to keep me. But you weren't struggling, were you, Davy? You were feeding off me. Mom, look, David started, but she cut him off with a raised hand. No, she said. You don't get to speak anymore. You're right. I might only have 6 months left, but I am going to live those 6 months in my house with my money, and I am going to make sure that when I do go, I leave this world with dignity. She turned to me. Judge, if he can't pay the money, what happens? If he cannot pay, I explained, the court will seize his assets. We will send the sheriff to auction off his car, his condo, and yes, that watch. The proceeds will go directly to you. Martha nodded slowly. She looked at her son one last time, then let the auction begin. David slumped onto the table, head in his hands. He was defeated, completely and utterly dismantled by the very paperwork he thought would protect him. But as I reached for my gavel to finalize the ruling, the courtroom doors opened again. A man in a gray suit walked in. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a cop. He was holding a clipboard. And he looked confused. Excuse me, Your Honor, the man said. I'm looking for David Sterling. I'm from the city building inspector's office. We received an emergency tip about the Oakwood property. David lifted his head, his eyes widening in a new kind of terror. A tip? I asked. What kind of tip? About the foundation, the inspector said. We were told the owner was doing illegal excavations to prepare for a commercial rezoning. If that's true, the house might be structurally compromised. We need to condemn it immediately. I looked at David. He had tried to turn the house into a resort. In his greed, had he literally dug the ground out from under his mother's feet? Condemn it? Martha's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the room like a scream. She gripped the armrests of her wheelchair, her knuckles white. She had just fought a war to get her home back, only to be told it might be pulled down around her ears. I looked at the building inspector. Explain yourself, sir. What kind of excavation? The inspector flipped through his clipboard. According to the report, a crew was out there last week digging trenches for a subterranean parking structure. They cut too close to the load-bearing walls. The contractor walked off the job because he said it was unsafe, but the owner told him to keep digging or he wouldn't get paid. I turned my gaze slowly to David. He was shrinking in his seat, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. You tried to put an underground garage under a 100-year-old Victorian house? I asked, my voice filled with disbelief. David wiped his mouth, his hand shaking. It was for the resort guests, valet parking. We needed to maximize the square footage. I thought we could reinforce it later. You thought? I slammed my hand on the bench. You undermined the foundation of the house your mother was sleeping in. You could have brought the whole thing down on top of her. I didn't know, David cried out. The engineers said it was risky, but possible. I didn't want to hurt her. You didn't care if you hurt her, I corrected him. You only cared about your property value. And now, look at what you've done. You've given her back a house that she can't live in. I turned back to the inspector. How bad is it? Can it be saved? The inspector hesitated. It's critical, Your Honor. The southwest corner is floating. If we get a heavy storm, and looking outside, it's pouring right now. The soil could shift. The kitchen might collapse into the trench. It needs emergency shoring, concrete injection, steel beams, immediately. How much? I asked. Estimates from the contractor who quit put it at around $200,000 minimum, and it needs to start today. I looked at Martha. She was staring at the floor, defeated. She had the deed in her hand, but a deed doesn't keep the rain off your head. She had won the battle, but David's greed had scorched the earth. I looked at David. You heard the man. 200,000. Today, David let out a hysterical laugh. It was the sound of a man who had snapped. I told you! I have no money. I just wired the last of the operating capital to pay off the mortgage. My personal accounts are frozen. I have nothing. Go ahead, send me to jail. At least there, I'll get a bed. He was right. I had squeezed him dry to pay the mortgage. The trust repayment would come from liquidating his personal assets, but that takes time. Auctions take weeks. Martha didn't have weeks. She didn't even have hours. The room felt hopeless. The rain hammered harder against the roof, emphasizing the danger at the house. But then, I remembered something David had said earlier. Something about his empire. Mr. Sterling, I said, my voice dangerously calm. You say you have no cash, but you still have one asset we haven't touched yet. David looked up, confused. What? I told you? My car? My watch? Take them. No, I said. I'm talking about your equity. You are the sole shareholder of Sterling Development, are you not? David's eyes went wide. That's my company. That's my life's work. It's an asset, I said. And right now, it's an asset owned by a debtor who owes a judgment debt for emergency repairs caused by his own negligence. I turned to the clerk. Draft an emergency receivership order. We are not seizing his watch. We are seizing his controlling interest in Sterling Development. David stood up, knocking his chair over. You can't do that. You can't take my company. That's worth 10 times the repair cost. Then you should have no trouble finding a lender to give you a bridge loan against your stock to fix the house, I countered. But since you burned every bridge in town, I'm going to do it for you. I looked at the inspector. Do you have the contact for the contractor who walked off the job? The one with a conscience? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Russo. He's actually waiting in the hallway. He wanted to make sure Mrs. Sterling was okay. Bring him in, I ordered. A moment later, a burly man in work boots and a rain-soaked jacket walked in. He looked at David with pure disdain and then took his hat off for Martha. Mr. Russo, I said, can you stabilize the house? I can, Your Honor, Russo said, his voice gravelly and firm. I got my crews and equipment 3 blocks away. I pulled them off because I wouldn't do the dig, but I can pump the concrete and brace it. We can save it. But I need a deposit. Concrete trucks don't roll on credit. Mr. Sterling is going to pay you, I said, pointing to David. He is going to transfer 20% of his company's stock to you as collateral for the repair bill. If he doesn't pay you cash within 30 days, you keep the stock. Do you accept? Russo looked at David, then at me. A grin spread across his face. Sterling Development stock? Yeah, I'll take that deal. David screamed. No, that's a hostile takeover. You're giving a construction foreman a seat on my board? I'm giving him leverage, I said. Sign the transfer, David, or the house falls, and I add reckless endangerment of an elderly person to your list of crimes. That carries a mandatory prison sentence. Choose your company shares or your freedom. David looked at the papers the clerk was printing. He looked at Russo, the man he had fired for being too safe. He looked at his mother, whose life he had endangered for a parking spot. He was cornered, he was beaten, and he knew it. With a shaking hand, he picked up the pen one last time. He wasn't just signing away money now, he was signing away his power. He was letting the little people, the contractors, the mothers, the judges take pieces of his precious empire. He signed, "Mr. Russo," I said, "get your trucks rolling. Save that house." Russo nodded. "On it, Judge." He turned to Martha and gently touched her shoulder. "Don't you worry, ma'am. I won't let a single brick fall." As Russo ran out of the room, dialing his phone to mobilize his crew, the atmosphere shifted. The danger wasn't gone, but the rescue was in motion. David slumped onto the table, his head buried in his arms. He was broken, financially, professionally, morally. He had walked in as a king and was leaving as a pauper, with a criminal record pending. But there was one final piece of business. The most important piece. I turned to Martha. She was exhausted, the adrenaline was fading, and the reality of the betrayal was setting in. She looked small and frail. "Mrs. Sterling," I said softly, "the house is yours. The repairs are paid for. The stolen money will be recovered from the auction of his personal items. But there is one thing the court cannot mandate." She looked up, her eyes wet. "What is that, Judge?" "Forgiveness," I said. "The law can restore your property, but it cannot fix your heart. That is entirely up to you." Martha looked at David. He didn't look up. He couldn't face her. "Judge," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Can I ask him one question?" "You may." Martha rolled her wheelchair a few inches closer to the plaintiff's table. "David?" He slowly lifted his head. His eyes were red, his face puffy. The arrogant CEO mask was gone. He looked like a frightened little boy. "Why?" she asked. "I gave you everything. I loved you more than my own life. Why wasn't it enough?" David opened his mouth to speak, to make an excuse, to blame the market or the stress. But then he looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in years. He saw the mother who had raised him, and the weight of his shame finally crushed him. "I don't know," he whispered, a tear leaking out. I wanted more. I always wanted more." "Well," Martha said, leaning back, "now you have less. And I hope that's finally enough for you." She turned her chair away from him. "I'm ready to go home now, Judge." The sound of the gavel ending the session felt like a period at the end of a long, painful sentence. "Case closed," I announced. David stood up. He moved slowly, like an old man. He reached for his briefcase, but then he stopped. He looked at his wrist out of habit, expecting to see the golden gleam of his Patek Philippe. But the watch was gone, surrendered to the bailiff 10 minutes ago as the first asset in the liquidation pile. He stared at his bare wrist for a long moment, rubbing the pale strip of skin where the gold used to sit. It was the first time in years he was seeing his own skin without a price tag covering it. He didn't look back at his mother. He couldn't. He turned and walked down the center aisle, his $3,000 Italian shoes scuffed against the floor. He pushed open the heavy wooden doors and stepped out into the hallway. Through the glass panels, I watched him walk toward the exit. He didn't have an umbrella. He didn't have a driver waiting anymore. The company car had been flagged for repossession. He just walked out into the pouring rain, a man who had traded his soul for an empire and ended up with neither. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was different. It was warm. Mr. Russo, the contractor, walked over to the bailiff's desk. "I'm heading to the site now, Judge. I'll send you photos of the shoring by tonight." Then he turned to Martha. "Mrs. Sterling, my truck is outside. It's not a limo, and the suspension is a little stiff, but it's dry. Can I give you a ride home?" Martha smiled. It was a weak smile, tired and worn, but it was genuine. "I would like that very much, Mr. Russo. Thank you." The bailiff helped Russo wheel her out. As she passed the bench, she paused one last time. She didn't say a word. She just nodded to me. A slow, deep nod of gratitude. I nodded back. Sometimes the most important rulings don't need to be spoken. When the doors swung shut behind them, the room fell silent. My clerk was already organizing the files for the next case, but I stayed in my chair for a moment. I thought about the house on Oakwood Drive. Tonight, there would be noise generators, pumps, men shouting instructions, as they poured concrete to save the foundation. It would be chaotic, but inside, Martha would be safe. She would sleep in her own bed. She would look out her window at the garden her husband planted. She would breathe. And I thought about David. Somewhere out there in the rain, he was making phone calls that nobody would answer. His friends in the business world, the ones who toasted his success at galas, would drop him the moment the news of the fraud hit the wires. That's the thing about relationships built on transaction. When your currency hits zero, so does your friendship. David had spent 10 years trying to build a legacy of steel and glass. He wanted his name on buildings. He wanted to be a titan. But in his rush to the top, he forgot the only foundation that actually holds a life together: family, loyalty, honor. He dug the ground out from under his own mother to build a garage for strangers. And in the end, he was the one who fell into the hole. I picked up the yellow folder, the one Arthur Pendleton had prepared all those years ago. That lawyer was dead and gone, but he had reached out from the grave to protect his client one last time. It's a reminder that good deeds echo longer than we think, and so do bad ones. People ask me why I'm so hard on people like David Sterling. They say, "Judge, he's a businessman. He was just being pragmatic." No, there is nothing pragmatic about cruelty. There is nothing business about stealing the safety of the woman who gave you life. The world is full of David Sterlings. They wear nice suits. They speak in legal jargon. They convince themselves that property value is more real than human value. They think the law is a game of chess where they can sacrifice pawns to protect the king. But in my courtroom, the king doesn't get special protection. In my courtroom, the king answers to the same truth as the pawn. Martha Sterling has 6 months left, maybe a year, but those months will be hers. She reclaimed her dignity today. And David? He has the rest of his life to think about the day he sold his mother for a parking spot and bought nothing but his own ruin. I stood up and unzipped my robe. The weight of the day lifted slightly. "Clerk," I said, walking toward my chambers. "What's next on the docket?" "A landlord suing a tenant for unpaid rent because the tenant used the money to fix the broken boiler," the clerk replied, reading the screen. I stopped at the door and smiled. A real smile this time. "Bring them in," I said. "I think I'm just warming up." Martha Sterling passed away peacefully in her sleep 8 months later, in her own bed at 42 Oakwood Drive. Her final months were spent in comfort, surrounded by neighbors and care staff paid for by the recovered trust funds. David Sterling was indicted on 3 counts of federal bank fraud. He is currently serving a 5-year sentence at a minimum security facility. He did not attend his mother's funeral. Mr. Russo's company completed the repairs. He was named the executor of Martha's estate. In her will, she left the house to a local charity for elderly care. Justice is not just about the law, it's about doing what is right.